All right, welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Where we're going to be going behind the Iron Curtain
Behind the Iron Curtain.
and exploring Soviet military doctrine during the Cold War.
Ooh, exciting.
Our source material for this one is a Soviet military handbook,
Okay.
likely used for officer training
All right.
in the 1970s, right?
Right in the thick of it.
In the heart of that ideological and military standoff with the U.S.,
Yeah.
our mission today is to extract key insights into how the Soviets viewed war itself,
Okay.
how they structured their military, their training,
Fascinating.
and even get a glimpse into how they perceive their adversaries.
It's interesting with this handbook.
Yeah.
It doesn't just give you the tactics. It really gives you like a window into the worldview.
Into their worldview.
Yeah.
So we're not talking just tanks and missiles,
Right.
but the mindset behind them.
Yeah. The thinking behind it.
Yeah.
The handbook makes it very clear that Soviet military doctrine was fundamentally rooted in Marxist-Leninist ideology. Everything flows from that core belief system.
So for them, war wasn't just some random event.
Right.
It was a direct product of their ideological struggle with the capitalist world.
Precisely.
Wow.
They saw war as an inevitable consequence of what they perceived as capitalism's inherent drive for expansion and exploitation. And this led to this very important distinction that they make between just and unjust wars.
Okay, so a war fought to defend the socialist homeland or to support a communist revolution somewhere else?
Yes.
That would be considered just in their eyes?
Yes, they would view that as a just war.
Okay.
And actually, this concept was used to justify interventions like in Hungary in '56 and Czechoslovakia in '68.
Oh, interesting.
Framing these actions as necessary to protect the socialist bloc from capitalist aggression.
I see.
This idea of just war allowed them to reconcile their ideology, which in theory emphasized peace, with the realities of maintaining a very powerful military.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
This is how they used ideology to square that circle.
Right.
But it wasn't all just rhetoric, was it?
No.
The Communist Party had a very real and direct control over the military.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The handbook, I mean, there's no room for doubt here.
Yeah.
The Communist Party was the ultimate authority when it came to military affairs.
Right.
And they had this system of political officers
Okay.
embedded at every level of the military.
So these political officers, they were more than just ideological cheerleaders, right?
Right, yeah, more than just cheerleaders.
Yeah.
Their task was to ensure ideological purity and loyalty within the ranks,
Yeah.
but also to instill what the handbook calls conscious military discipline.
So not just blind obedience,
Right.
but like a deep-seated belief in the cause.
Exactly, a deep-seated belief.
Wow.
The Soviets really believed that a soldier who was fighting for a cause they believed in was inherently a much more effective soldier.
It's fascinating
It really is.
that they're using ideology as a force multiplier.
It's a force multiplier.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just theoretical. They really put a lot of effort into this psychological training,
Yeah.
shaping the mindset of their troops.
This makes me think about how their worldview was also shaped by their own history.
Of course.
The victory in World War II must have been a huge part of their narrative.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the handbook constantly invokes the Great Patriotic War, as they called it,
Yeah.
as proof of the strength of the socialist system, the superiority of their military doctrine.
Right.
They attribute their victory to the party's leadership, the resilience of the Soviet people,
Yeah.
and of course, the inherent flaws of the capitalist system.
So they're using history here to reinforce their ideology,
Yeah.
to justify this military buildup.
It's a very powerful narrative.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
But how does it actually translate into military thinking?
Yeah, good question.
What did Soviet military science look like?
Well, this is where we see this kind of surprising emphasis on the scientific basis of warfare.
Yep.
They didn't just rely on brute force. They really sought to understand what they called the objective laws of conflict,
Right.
using scientific analysis to predict and shape the course of war.
So almost like turning warfare into a science itself.
Yeah,
But isn't war inherently unpredictable and chaotic?
that's a good point.
Yeah.
And they did acknowledge the role of chance and human factors,
Okay.
but they believed that by studying history, analyzing data, developing these sophisticated models, they could gain a strategic edge.
Interesting.
They even divided military science into distinct branches. Strategy,
Okay.
which focused on the big picture, operational art,
Right.
dealing with the planning and execution of campaigns,
Oh.
and then tactics, concerning the actual conduct of battles.
So a systematic approach.
Yeah, very systematic.
Almost like they were trying to dissect war and understand its inner workings.
Yeah, the inner workings of war.
Did they apply this scientific approach to their own doctrine?
Yes.
What were they preparing for?
The handbook is very clear about this. Their primary focus was preparing for a potential large-scale war,
Okay.
essentially even a nuclear war, with what they called the imperialist powers,
Right.
particularly the United States.
So the ultimate nightmare scenario.
The nightmare scenario.
So how did they plan on fighting
Right.
or, I guess, deterring such a war?
Well, deterrence was key. Absolutely key. They
Right.
wanted to project an image of strength
Uh-huh.
to make it clear that any aggression against the Soviet Union or its allies would be met with overwhelming force.
I see.
This meant maintaining a very large
Okay.
and well-equipped military, constantly ready for action.
Right.
They even had a term for it, constant combat readiness.
Wow.
Yeah.
But this was also a time of rapid technological change.
It was.
How did they factor that into their thinking?
They were very aware of this revolution in military affairs,
Uh-huh.
brought about by nuclear weapons and other advancements.
Right.
The handbook devotes a lot of space to this, discussing the importance of military modernization, of staying ahead of the curve.
So they weren't just relying on the lessons of the past.
Right.
They were looking to the future,
Yeah, look into the future.
trying to anticipate how technology would shape the battlefield.
Exactly.
So they've got their ideology.
Yeah.
They've got this scientific approach, their focus on deterrence and modernization.
Right?
But how does this all translate into actual military power?
Well, that's what we're going to be getting into next time.
That's what we're going to explore in part 2, the Soviet military machine itself.
The machine itself.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into Soviet military doctrine.
Back again.
Last time we uncovered this unique blend of ideology and scientific thinking.
Right.
Their focus on deterrence and that real drive to stay ahead in the technological arms race.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's get into the nuts and bolts.
Let's do it.
The Soviet military machine itself.
All right.
So the handbook actually provides a pretty detailed look
Yeah, it does.
at the structure of their armed forces.
It's almost like a blueprint.
Like a blueprint for their military power.
Yeah, for their military power.
Okay, so let's break it down.
Okay.
What were the key branches of the Soviet military?
All right.
And what roles did they play in their overall strategy?
Well, at the very top of the pyramid, you had the strategic rocket forces.
Yep.
Armed with nuclear missiles, this was their ultimate deterrent.
Right.
The backbone of their strategy for preventing a full-scale war with the West.
Their shield, so to speak.
The shield.
But they needed a sword as well, right?
They did, of course.
Forces that could actually fight on the ground, in the air, and at sea.
Right. So you have the massive ground forces.
Okay.
With tank armies, motorized infantry, artillery, air defense units, the whole lot.
Wow.
And their doctrine really emphasized offensive operations, rapid advances, and just the ability to overwhelm the enemy with sheer firepower.
Sounds pretty formidable.
Yeah.
What about air and naval power?
Okay.
How did those fit into the overall strategy?
The Air Force was tasked with supporting that ground offensive,
Right.
providing air cover, conducting reconnaissance, and striking key targets behind enemy lines.
I see.
They also had a significant bomber force, capable of delivering both conventional and nuclear payloads.
So a truly multifaceted force.
Yeah, a multifaceted force.
And what about their navy?
Well, the Soviet Navy, while not quite as large as the U.S. Navy, focused on submarines,
Okay.
particularly those armed with nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles.
Right.
These submarines could essentially lurk undetected in the vast oceans,
Yeah.
providing a secure second-strike capability even if their land-based forces were destroyed.
So even if the worst happened,
Even if the worst happened,
they could still retaliate.
they could retaliate.
It's a chilling thought, but it makes strategic sense,
It does, yeah.
given their focus on deterrence.
Deterrence is key.
Yeah, and throughout the handbook, you see this real emphasis on technology.
Yeah.
It's like they were obsessed with modernization,
Almost obsessed.
with keeping pace with the West in developing new and more powerful weapon systems.
Absolutely. So can I give you some examples?
Yes, please.
All right. They made really significant strides in tank design,
Okay.
producing these heavily armored and heavily armed tanks like the T-72,
Yeah?
which was designed to be highly mobile and extremely lethal.
Wow.
They also invested a lot in artillery, developing long-range and highly accurate systems that were capable of just delivering massive firepower.
So clearly aiming for overwhelming force on the ground.
Overwhelming force, yeah.
But what about in the air and at sea?
Yeah, good question.
Were there any technological breakthroughs that stand out?
Well, in the air, they developed these advanced fighter jets like the MiG-29, which was
Okay.
designed to try and challenge Western air superiority.
Right.
They also experimented with new bomber designs, trying to extend their reach and enhance their strike capabilities.
Right.
And at sea, their focus on submarines led to advancements in sonar technology and underwater propulsion systems.
So they were pushing the boundaries on multiple fronts.
Multiple fronts, yeah.
It's really fascinating to see how their technological drive was intertwined with their strategic goals.
It's all connected.
It's all connected, yeah.
And this brings us to another key aspect of their military power: training.
Okay.
The handbook reveals this very rigorous
Yeah.
and comprehensive system for preparing their troops for combat.
Let's dive into that.
Okay.
What did their training regimen look like?
All right.
What were they trying to instill in their soldiers?
Their training was based on this very systematic approach,
Okay.
building upon previous knowledge and experience.
Uh-huh.
They emphasized practical exercises, drills, and simulations,
Right.
all designed to try and make the training as realistic as possible.
I see.
And they also incorporated the latest scientific and psychological principles,
Okay.
recognizing that modern warfare required more than just physical strength and tactical skill.
So they were preparing their soldiers for the mental and emotional stresses of combat as well.
Yeah, the mental and emotional stresses.
Yeah.
They put a lot of emphasis on psychological training,
Okay.
teaching soldiers how to manage stress, overcome fear, and maintain morale under extreme pressure.
Wow.
They even had these specialized exercises designed to familiarize troops with the sights, sounds,
Yeah.
and even the smells of battle.
That's pretty intense.
It's intense.
But it makes sense given the kind of warfare they were preparing for.
Yeah, it does.
Were there any other aspects of their training that stand out?
One thing that stood out to me was their emphasis on developing what they call the moral potential of their troops.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Right, it sounds a bit abstract.
Yeah.
But it refers to these intangible qualities
Okay.
that make a soldier effective in combat. Things like courage, discipline, loyalty,
Uh-huh.
and a willingness to sacrifice for the cause.
Right.
They believe that these qualities were just as important as physical strength or tactical skill,
Interesting.
and they went to great lengths to cultivate them in their troops.
So it's about creating soldiers who are not only skilled, but also deeply committed to the cause.
Deeply committed, yeah.
Yeah.
And this leads us to another really fascinating aspect of their military thinking: their view of their adversaries.
Okay, this is where things get interesting.
This is where it gets interesting.
We know how they viewed themselves.
Yeah.
Their ideology, their military power.
Mm-hmm.
But how did they see the other side?
Well, they saw the U.S. military as a formidable force, technologically advanced and capable of projecting power globally.
Right.
They studied U.S. doctrine, they analyzed U.S. weapons systems,
Well,
and they even tried to understand the psychology of American soldiers.
so it was more than just ideological posturing.
Yeah, more than posturing.
They were genuinely trying to understand their adversary,
They're trying to understand.
to figure out how to counter their strengths and exploit their weaknesses.
Absolutely. They viewed the Cold War as this strategic chess match,
Right.
a battle of wits as much as a battle of weapons. And they knew that to win, they needed to understand their opponent as well as they understood themselves.
It sounds like they were taking a very methodical and analytical approach.
Very methodical.
Did they identify any specific areas where they thought they had an advantage over the U.S. military?
Well, they believed that their centralized command structure gave them greater flexibility and speed in decision-making.
I see.
They also felt they had an edge in terms of sheer manpower and conventional firepower, particularly in their tank forces and artillery.
So they saw themselves as having a more streamlined command structure
Streamlined, yeah.
and a numerical advantage in certain areas.
Right.
But did they acknowledge any areas where the U.S. might have an edge?
They did. They recognized the U.S. Navy's global reach and superior naval power,
Uh-huh.
particularly in terms of aircraft carriers.
Right.
They also acknowledged the U.S.'s technological prowess in certain areas like aviation and missile technology.
So it wasn't just blind confidence.
No, not blind confidence.
They had a realistic assessment of their adversary's capabilities,
Realistic assessment.
both strengths and weaknesses.
Strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. And this nuanced understanding is what makes their analysis so fascinating.
It really is.
It reveals a military machine that was not only powerful,
Yeah.
but also highly intelligent,
Highly intelligent.
constantly adapting and evolving to meet the challenges of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
This has given us a fascinating glimpse, I think,
Yeah.
into the workings of the Soviet military machine, their training, their technology,
Mm-hmm.
and even their view of their rivals.
Right.
But we've been focusing mainly on the physical and strategic aspects.
Of course.
What about the ideological dimension?
Right.
How did their beliefs shape their actions on the global stage?
Well, that's a crucial question.
Yeah.
And it's one we'll explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
Part 3.
Yeah, we'll examine how their ideology influenced their foreign policy,
Right.
their support for revolutions around the world,
Yeah.
and their overall approach to the global balance of power.
So stay tuned to Part 3, where we delve into the ideological heart of the Soviet military machine
The ideological heart.
and its impact on the world. Welcome back to our deep dive into Soviet military doctrine. We've explored their structure, their training, their technology, and even their assessment of the U.S. military. But now let's tackle the question that's been looming over this whole discussion.
Ideology.
Exactly. We've touched on it throughout, but how did this Marxist-Leninist worldview actually play out in their actions on the global stage?
Well, it's important to remember that for the Soviets, their military power wasn't just about defending borders. They saw themselves as the vanguard of a global communist movement, actively supporting revolutions and liberation movements around the world.
So they were playing a much bigger game, a global ideological struggle against what they perceived as capitalist imperialism.
Precisely. Their military doctrine wasn't just about winning wars, it was about advancing the cause of world communism. This belief shaped their foreign policy, their alliances, their interventions in other countries.
Can you give us some specific examples of how this played out? How do they use their military power to further their ideological goals?
We'll take their involvement in the Vietnam War, for example. They provided extensive military aid to North Vietnam, including weapons training and advisors, seeing it as a key battleground in the fight against U.S. imperialism.
So they weren't directly involved in the fighting, but they were playing a critical role behind the scenes.
Exactly. They also supported communist movements in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, providing arms training and sometimes even direct military intervention.
It's fascinating how their actions, while often framed as defensive, were actually quite proactive in spreading their ideology.
And it wasn't just about direct military involvement. They also used their military power to project an image of strength, to deter their adversaries, and to bolster the confidence of their allies.
So a combination of hard and soft power, all aimed at advancing their ideological agenda. Did they have any successes? Were they effective in spreading their influence around the globe?
They certainly had some notable successes. The victory of the communists in Vietnam was a major propaganda coup for them, and it helped fuel communist movements in other parts of the world.
But didn't they also face setbacks? Weren't there places where their support for communist movements backfired?
Absolutely. Their intervention in Afghanistan, for example, turned into a costly and protracted conflict that ultimately contributed to their own decline.
So it's a mixed bag, with successes and failures. But one thing is clear. Their ideology played a central role in shaping their actions on the world stage.
And this brings us back to the Handbook. Remember, this document wasn't just a dry military manual. It was infused with ideology, with the belief that they were fighting a just war, a war to liberate the world from the evils of capitalism.
And this belief must have had a profound impact on the mindset of their officers, the way they viewed their mission, the way they made decisions.
Absolutely. It's one thing to study tactics and strategy. It's another thing entirely to believe that you're fighting for a cause that's bigger than yourself, a cause that will ultimately reshape the world.
That's a powerful motivator. But it can also be dangerous, can't it? I mean, if you believe you're on the right side of history, it can lead to a sense of infallibility, a willingness to justify any means to achieve your ends.
That's a very astute observation, and it's something that we need to keep in mind as we analyze their actions, their decisions, the way they wielded their immense military power.
So we've explored their ideology, their structure, their training, their technology, and their actions on the world stage. What's the key takeaway for our listeners? What's the enduring relevance of understanding Soviet military doctrine today?
I think the most important lesson is that military power is never just about weapons and tactics. It's always intertwined with ideology, with beliefs, with a vision of the world.
So to truly understand a military force, you need to understand their mindset, their motivations, their worldview.
Precisely. And this is just as relevant today as it was during the Cold War. We live in a world where military power is still a major factor in international relations. And to navigate this complex landscape, we need to understand not just what countries do, but why they do it, what they believe in, what they're fighting for.
That's a powerful message. And it brings our deep dive into Soviet military doctrine to a close. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.